Hey guys, Laura here. I want to go through this Leaving Cert history essay with you today from the 2019 paper. The topic is the Dictatorship and Democracy. It's the question there on the characteristics of the fascist regimes. Now, I'm going to go through this essay, kind of just parts of it. So I do recommend that you have a good read through the entire essay before we start breaking it down, so you're clear on what exactly I'm talking about if I refer to different parts of the essay. But in saying that, you will be able to find a fully annotated version of the essay on Studyclix if you'd like a bit more detail on it afterwards. So let's get into it. I'm going to firstly have a look at the question. You know, you have a lot of choice on your Leaving Cert history paper and you have to make those choices really quickly. So what to look out for when you're making your choice, and then to make sure that you're covering everything that you need to cover for the examiner. So a really small thing to look out for there are the two words I've highlighted, and a really important letter at the end of those two words, the S's. Keep an eye out for plurals. I know it might sound silly, but what were the characteristics? So more than one characteristic. So it could be common that you could nearly write an entire essay just on the propaganda. Do you know what I mean? But that's only one characteristic. So just be careful there. And the same goes with regimes. You could write the entire essay just on Hitler's regime, but you have to mention at least two. Simple thing, but look out for the plurals. The specific dates aren't mentioned, but it does say the interwar years, which are dates that you will know. So remember, keep an eye on them. Make sure you give some context to before and during World War I, but make sure then that you cover the entire span of the interwar years, right up to 1938. The characteristics then, I've already highlighted it there, but that's really important as well. So if I keep referring back to that word, then I'm definitely referring to the question, and I'm showing the examiner that I'm not just listing everything that each of the fascist regimes did. I'm pointing out the characteristics or traits or parts or plots, or like that kind of stuff. Keep referring back to that word and you have the question in your head and you're on the right track completely. The Leaving Cert history examiners are given this piece of information when correcting the paragraphs. The paragraphs, are all divided into 12 marks, and the best 5 then are chosen. So how do I try and turn my possibly good or very good paragraphs into excellent paragraphs? Well, ask yourself, is my paragraph outstanding? Is it substantial? Two really important words. I get asked this a lot. Is your work really exceptional? Is it really substantial? Do you have every piece of fact and quote and information and date and statistic needed to prove whatever point or help your argument in whatever way you need it to in this particular paragraph? Keep those two words in your mind as you're writing your paragraphs, reading over your own essays, and indeed reading any of the other sample answers that you come across. So now let's get into the actual essay. I'm going to start looking at the introduction here, and it's pretty good. A few things that I would like to point out. So it starts off nice between the years of 1918 and 1939. So there you have the interwar years, that's fine. But I would think it's really important to set the scene a little bit more, especially in relation to post-World War Europe. The effect of World War I on Europe is important to just point that out there. It mentions straight away, obviously, fascist leaders. A short definition of fascism would be fantastic there, just so you can show the examiner, I know exactly what fascism is. I'm not mixing it up with communism or something like that. I know what fascism is, and this is what it is. So learn off a 1 or 2 sentence definition of fascism. Down a little bit, it talks about the discontent that existed. This links back to my first point about post-World War I Europe. The main reason that fascism was able to arise after World War I was because of this discontent. So that needs to be elaborated on a little bit more there. You could talk about how people were so annoyed about the Treaty of Versailles, the high levels of unemployment, the loss of land, all of that grievance led to people being annoyed at their democratic governments, etc., and the fascist leaders were able to swoop in and take charge. So a little bit more detail on that would be nice to set the scene. Now this is really important, folks. That final sentence there has a big long list of all of the traits that this essay is going to cover. But I've obviously read this whole essay now, maybe you have as well, and it doesn't cover all of those things. So don't do that. Don't list these elements if your essay doesn't then follow this list. It's why sometimes people might go back and write their introduction at the end of their essay, It might be something to practice doing, guys, before your actual exam. Leave your intro to the end. Have a little think about it, but don't have an introduction that says you're going to do this and then you don't do it. Be very, very careful of that. Now, I'm not saying that having those lists isn't a good idea. It's a very nice idea, as long as you then make sure you have enough time and space and everything to actually follow that list. Be careful with that one there. Now, getting into the main body of the essay, as I said, I'm not going to go through the entire essay. I'm firstly going to look at paragraphs 1 and 2, which basically deal with the characteristic of, as I've already mentioned, propaganda. So this essay deals with characteristics, and then it looks at Mussolini, and then it looks at Hitler. You could structure this essay to be all Hitler and then all Mussolini, but I do think it's better that you go by characteristics. So go with propaganda and then the two leaders, and then maybe violence and then the two leaders, or something like that. So what's good about this chunk and what needs to be improved on? I don't particularly like this language. Keep it a bit more formal. Italy's Mussolini used a fair amount of propaganda. I know what you mean, but keep it a bit more formal. This person has learned off a nice chunk of information. They've lots of specific examples of the propaganda used. You see lots of statistics there and dates and quotes and, people being named. So this person has the right information. Very, very accurate. At the start of the second paragraph there, the word also is a lovely simple linking phrase that you can do. Remember, your Leaving Cert history essay should have a kind of a thread running through them that connects it all. So that's a really simple way. Now be careful. Some people take that word also and they put it at the start of every single paragraph. That's not a good idea either. So use linking phrases, but do vary them. More great specific examples at the bottom of that paragraph in relation to Hitler, but there is no main reference back to the question. So you could have talked about all of these different elements of propaganda as a characteristic of the fascist regime. And then at the very end there, you could talk about them and you could say something like, and all of these propaganda techniques became incredibly common and allowed the fascist leaders to seize power. Something along those lines. So great information here, but not quite enough awareness of the question. Skipping down to paragraphs 5 and 6. This first sentence, a lack of political oppression was common between the two. And it's not clear to me what this person means. Do they mean opposition? Do they mean that because Hitler's fascist party and Mussolini's fascist party weren't oppressed, as in they had no one oppressing them? Is that what they mean? Or do they mean that a lack of political opposition was common between the two? Now that makes a bit more sense to me, but I'm not really sure that that's a characteristic of a fascist regime. Not like it lacks clarity is what I'm getting at there. So be careful, watch your language. More great specific dates. This person knows their information, they have all of the right information and they're using it in the right way. At the start of the next paragraph, it talks about another factor was that both countries were ultra nationalistic. And I feel that the layout of this essay is a little bit out of whack. It's a bit out of sync, because the fact that mentioning the ultra-nationalism, that's very much linked to the propaganda. And I feel that this paragraph should have been back kind of connected to the previous two that I had spoken about already. This is an essay that when I look at it, I would love to cut up all the paragraphs and rearrange them like a jigsaw, So have a little think about a plan. I know you don't have loads of time on your Leaving Cert history paper, but this is where the practice beforehand comes in. Think about the order in which you give the information. And then they mention it and then they kind of don't really give me enough. So you could talk a lot here about the anti-Semitism, all of the different cultural celebrations, the sporting celebrations, all of those things that became a really common factor in these fascist regimes, this celebration of their heritage and their country, their nation, their nationalism. So if you're going to mention it, go all out and make sure you give me enough detail on it. Moving on now finally, guys, to the conclusion. Now, straight away when you look at that without even reading a single word, you can see that it's only one sentence. And it's a big long list. And that's fine. That's a great way to start off your conclusion. But it needs to be a bit stronger. It is a nice simple summation of what was covered. What was covered in my previous 3 or 4 or 5 pages. Lovely. But I need more. You need to sum up your findings. So when you look at all of the things that you used, you can talk about how, the use of these things allowed the fascist leaders come to power. You've proven that the use of the secret police and extreme nationalism was the most effective in, something along those lines. And then, of course, have a think about what was the point of all this? What did it lead to? Well, it led to World War II. These guys were able to use these characteristics to come to power and then keep using those characteristics to basically go to war. That's kind of the point. So put all of the things that you have spoken about into the wider context of, the results of all of these characteristics. And the main result of all these characteristics is basically World War II. So that brings me to the end, folks, of my breakdown of this particular Leaving Cert history essay. I did only go through a few paragraphs, so don't be afraid to check out the full essay on Studyclix for a bit more detail. And I hope you found that helpful, and I will talk to you again.